There are very few historical miscalculations quite as paradoxical as Prohibition, a noble crusade that somehow managed to make America drunker and infinitely more criminal. In January 1920, the 18th Amendment went into effect, ushering in the National Prohibition Act and a grand social experiment, a country with no legal alcohol. What followed was a solution that was far worse than the initial problem. Hello, I hope we're all well. This is my cat. He was screaming at the door, so oh god, now he's in here. So today's topic is something that I have sort of briefly touched on before. In a lot of ways, I think Prohibition was literally just a catalyst for organized crime, but that's a story for a different day. And I have wanted to make this video ever since, so here we are. Now, I just filmed something else, so the makeup is obviously already done. I hope that's not a deal breaker. Normally, I do my makeup during these videos to give you something to watch as well as listen to, but today we're just going to focus on the story. Now, the idea of Prohibition, of course, was to create a morally upright, sober society. They called it the Noble Experiment. What America got instead was Al Capone, crappy bathtub gin, a booming black market economy, and a lot of funerals. This is the tale of Prohibition and how it was basically the catalyst for organized crime. So first off, it's important for us to acknowledge that Prohibition did not just spring up from out of nowhere. The temperance movement had been growing for an entire century, stirred up by religious groups and reformers who believed that alcohol was the source of a lot of societal problems, violence, crime, etc., which is painfully ironic. Now, initially, they only encouraged moderation. But over time, of course, the goalpost moves back and then back a little more, and eventually it was full-on abstinence from alcohol. And America in the late 1800s was, in fact, soaked in booze. Saloons were as common as streetlights. And this would obviously culminate in the passage of Prohibition laws. And not only was it implemented on a national scale, it was also written into the Constitution. But when the government outlawed the sale, production, and transportation of alcohol in 1920, they failed to consider one teeny tiny little detail. People really like to drink. And listen, be brutally honest with me here, okay? If you are told that you cannot have something anymore, how do you react? You want it more than ever, right? Within weeks of Prohibition's arrival, illegal speakeasies began popping up everywhere, hidden behind soda fountains, barber shops, even church basements, serving everything from moonshine to imported scotch, served with a side of police bribery. The law meant to promote abstinence from alcohol, instead cultivated indulgence. But the law had a few loopholes and legal exceptions. Enough that some people could take full advantage. For example, pharmacists could actually prescribe whiskey for various ailments back then, which is so crazy today, but bootleggers knew this and they would open pharmacies as a front for their trade. Matter of fact, during Prohibition, the number of registered pharmacists tripled. And the law did not outlaw consumption or possession, so the grape industry even got in on this. So they started selling kits of juice concentrate, and they had warnings on them saying, hey, don't leave these sitting out for too long because they could ferment and turn into wine. Wink, wink. I cannot wink, oh my god. Libraries had pamphlets on distilling at home. The law banning alcohol was just motivating people to learn how to make it themselves. Which leads us to many future mobsters were born at the turn of the century and came of age during Prohibition. They saw a business opportunity in this massive illegal market and they exploited it. Men like Lucky Luciano, Ben Siegel, Tony Cornero, and of course the notorious Al Capone, they did not just do crime, they industrialized it. These were not your everyday pickpockets and back alley thugs. They were strategic and scarily efficient businessmen. Al Capone alone was raking in about $100 million a year by the mid-20s, more than the federal budget for enforcement. So now he is not just breaking the law, he is outcompeting it. Now, the mafia existed long before Prohibition, but generally they were not a unified organization. Terms like organized crime and syndicate were not even widely used until after Prohibition started. So the huge profits and the resulting organizational infrastructure that they developed in that era, they had to hire accountants, lawyers, brewmasters, etc., really accelerated their growth and power. Crime syndicates learned logistics, accounting, branding, HR management, etc., all while going after rival bars with Tommy guns. So now bootlegging has become the core of organized crime's portfolio, and federal efforts to contain this chaos were laughable. The Prohibition Bureau was notoriously underfunded and overcorrupted. Agents were either outnumbered, outgunned, or wound up on the payroll of the people they were meant to arrest. A lot of them took bribes, some were even tempted to go into bootlegging themselves. It was that lucrative. And because of this, the public didn't really have a whole lot of trust in law enforcement anymore. And in the government's eyes, that wasn't the only thing that went horribly wrong. The economic effects of Prohibition were negative. The closing of saloons, breweries, distilleries, etc. meant that thousands of people lost their jobs. And it wasn't just them. Lots of truckers and barrel makers lost their jobs, as well as restaurant staff, because a lot of restaurants failed. They could not make enough profit without the liquor sales. And there was a steep decline in the entertainment industry as well. Overall, it cost the federal government about $11 billion in lost tax revenue, on top of the cost to actually enforce the law. And on top of all of that, people were dying in more ways than one. This homemade, unregulated alcohol was obviously very poor quality, which resulted in an average of about 1,000 Americans dying every year from tainted liquor. And then there was the violence. So much violence. The lucrative nature of the bootlegging trade led to violent gang wars, as different organizations fought for control of territories and distribution networks. In 1920s Chicago, the beer wars raged. Johnny Torrio, Al Capone's predecessor, had made deals with other gangs to try and avoid bloodshed, but it was not enough. Mobsters took out hundreds of their own, and police took out more. And of course, there was the infamous St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929, where 7 Northside Gang associates were taken out, and suspicion fell on Al Capone, which we talked all about that and the beer wars in his video. And the mob clashes in New York were horrific as well. During Prohibition, over 1,000 people died in just that one state. So the reality beneath the Art Deco glamour was brutal. Violence became a significant problem. Entire communities were destabilized. Killings and bombings changed the landscape of the country during the 20s, early 30s, which completely erased the little support people actually had for prohibition laws. So the public lost their trust in law enforcement right as the mafia were growing in power. In Chicago, the outfit was spawned from prohibition wealth. In New York, the infamous 5 families, largely represented by Al Capone and Lucky Luciano, respectively. In cities like Chicago and New York, mobsters ran the governments. They didn't just sell liquor, they bought police, judges, entire elections. Corruption seeped into the very fabric of American institutions. Despite the carnage, organized crime gained a strange sort of allure during the Prohibition era. Gangsters were both feared and admired. They wore fancy suits, they opened free soup kitchens, they tipped extravagantly. So in this era marked by economic hardship and governmental hypocrisy, they came off as twisted sort of folk heroes, Robin Hoods with a payroll and Tommy guns. The mafia used Prohibition to embed itself so deeply into American society that by the time Prohibition was repealed in 1933, it was irreversible. Organized crime was no longer a bootlegging business, it was an institution. In December 1933, Prohibition ended, but the criminal enterprises it spawned did not. They evolved, they adapted. I mean, once you've built $1 million distribution network for illegal goods, why stop at liquor? America had effectively handed a golden business opportunity to its underworld and then had the nerve to act surprised when it didn't just go away. So gambling, loan sharking, protection rackets, and trafficking became the new product. In terms of the characters we briefly mentioned, Lucky Luciano became the boss of everything in New York, Al Capone went to Alcatraz, Ben Siegel and others went to Las Vegas and its legal casinos, which we talked all about in the Vegas series, and Tony Cornero went to the high seas on his gambling ship, which we talked about in the last video. The grand irony of Prohibition is that it tried to outlaw a symptom rather than cure the cause. Alcohol abuse and the resulting violence were very real issues, but banning booze didn't address the root problem. Now, am I saying that everyone who drinks has a problem? Of course not. Was part of the temperance movement problem just old-timey hysteria? Probably. But instead of healing, America created a booming shadow economy and taught a generation of gangsters how to run empires. It's a cautionary tale, really. I mean, legislating morality is a tricky business, especially when you underestimate how determined people can be when they're chasing a vice. For every law, there's a loophole. For every government agent, a gangster with deeper pockets. Today, the Prohibition era has taken on a sort of mythic quality. But beneath the fedoras and jazz clubs, it remains one of the best examples of how a policy can catastrophically backfire. Organized crime, as we know it, structured, transnational, persistently adaptive, was born in the dry years and has been with us ever since, moving through eras, swapping cigars and Tommy guns for credit card fraud and cybercrime. Prohibition proved once and for all that banning something does not make it disappear. It just sends it into the shadows, where it grows fangs. Alright, and that is a wrap for today. I hope you liked my tale. Thank you for coming over, and as always, if you have any story ideas, please feel free to comment them so I can see what you want to see. And with that, I will see you next week. Toodaloo!